The blood-red Arizona sun cast eerie shadows across the canyon walls as Pearl Kincaid regained consciousness, her body battered and broken against the unforgiving rocks. She remembered the glint of her stepbrother's silver pistol, his cruel laughter as he pushed her over the edge, and the sickening sensation of falling. She had known about the stolen bank money, and in Liam's eyes, that knowledge was enough to warrant her death. Now, as she lay motionless in the depths of Rattlesnake Canyon, the vultures had begun to circle above, patient in their vigil. Pearl tried to move but collapsed with a whimper. Her once pristine blue dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood, her honey blonde hair matted against her scalp. At 22 years old, she had never imagined dying alone in the wilderness. The homestead she'd shared with her late father and treacherous stepfamily was miles away, and nobody else knew where she was. Tears slid down her dust-covered cheeks as she accepted her fate. The sound of hoofbeats echoed against the canyon walls, but Pearl was too weak to call out. She closed her eyes, thinking perhaps death had finally come for her. What in tarnation? A deep voice muttered. Through half-lidded eyes, Pearl saw the silhouette of a tall man dismounting from his horse. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat as he approached cautiously, his spurs jingling with each step. "Miss, can you hear me?" The stranger knelt beside her, pushing back his hat to reveal a sun-weathered face with piercing blue eyes. He couldn't be much older than 30, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. Pearl tried to speak but could only manage a weak moan. "You're alive," he said, a mixture of surprise and relief in his voice. He glanced up at the canyon rim high above them. "Did you fall? Or were you pushed?" Pearl managed to whisper. "Pushed." His expression hardened. "Bastards." He removed his bandana and gently wiped the blood from her forehead. "I'm Yates Thornton. I've got a cabin not far from here. Can you tell me your name?" "Pearl," she managed, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Pearl Kincaid." Yates nodded, assessing her injuries with a practiced eye. "You've got some broken ribs, maybe more. I need to move you, and it's going to hurt something fierce. I'm sorry for that." Pearl's eyes widened with fear as he prepared to lift her. He paused, his gaze softening. "Don't be scared. You're mine to protect now. I promise I'll get you somewhere safe." With surprising gentleness, he lifted her into his arms. Pearl cried out as pain shot through her body, then surrendered to the darkness that engulfed her once more. When Pearl next opened her eyes, she was lying on a soft bed in a small but tidy cabin. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow throughout the single room. She tried to sit up but gasped at the sharp pain in her side. "Easy there," came Yates's voice from across the room. He approached with a cup of steaming liquid. "You've been out nearly 2 days. I was starting to worry." Pearl looked down to find herself dressed in a man's shirt that engulfed her small frame. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I had to tend to your wounds," Yates explained, noting her discomfort. "There's a widow, Mrs. Abernathy, who lives about a mile from here. She helped clean you up proper so your modesty's intact. The shirt's mine, though. Hope you don't mind." "Thank you," Pearl whispered, her throat parched. "Drink this," he said, holding the cup to her lips. "It's willow bark tea. Tastes awful, but it'll help with the pain." The bitter liquid made her grimace, but she drank it dutifully. "You've got 3 broken ribs, a sprained ankle, and enough cuts and bruises to last a lifetime," Yates explained. "But nothing that won't heal with time. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Kincaid." "Pearl," she corrected softly. "Please call me Pearl," he nodded with a slight smile. "Pearl it is. Now, when you're feeling up to it, I'd like to hear how you ended up at the bottom of Rattlesnake Canyon." Pearl hesitated, unsure how much to trust this stranger. But something in his straightforward manner and the gentle way he tended to her wounds made her believe he meant her no harm. "It was my stepbrother, Liam," she began. "My father died 6 months ago, leaving the farm to me. Liam and my stepmother weren't pleased." The words came slowly at first, then faster as she recounted how they had made her life miserable. How Liam had fallen in with a dangerous crowd, and how she had discovered them counting stolen money from the Prescott Bank robbery. When Liam realized I'd seen them, he told me we were going for a ride. He took me to the canyon edge and Pearl's voice broke. And pushed you over, Yates finished, his jaw tight with anger. Pearl nodded, tears streaming down her face. They'll think I'm dead. Everyone will. Yates poured a glass of water and handed it to her. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, for now at least. If they think you're dead, they won't come looking for you. But the farm, my father's farm, will still be there when you're healed, and we've figured out how to deal with your stepbrother and his gang. Yates sat on the edge of the bed. I was a Texas Ranger before I came out here. I know how to handle men like Liam. Pearl studied him, noting the confident set of his shoulders and the way his hands moved with assured precision. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Yates considered her question for a moment. Because it's the right thing to do. And because 5 years ago, I wasn't there when someone needed me. A shadow crossed his face. I don't intend to make that mistake again. Over the next several days, Pearl's strength gradually returned. Yates proved to be a skilled caretaker, changing her bandages, preparing simple but nourishing meals, and keeping her company during the long hours of recovery. Each morning, he would ride out to check his traps and patrol the perimeter of his property, returning by midday with news from town or fresh game for dinner. Pearl learned that Yates had built the cabin himself 3 years ago, seeking solitude after his time with the Rangers. He rarely spoke of his past, though occasionally he would mention a brother in California and parents long deceased. "Why did you leave the Rangers?" Pearl asked one evening as they sat by the fire, she in a rocking chair and he whittling a piece of wood at the table. The rhythm of his knife faltered momentarily. "I tracked down a gang that had been terrorizing settlements along the border. Their leader was a man named Caleb Hardin." Yates set down the knife. "He killed my partner right in front of me. I got Hardin, but afterward. The badge didn't feel right anymore." "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly. Yates shrugged. "It was a lifetime ago. Out here I found peace." He glanced around the cabin. "Though I suppose it's not much compared to what you're used to." Pearl followed his gaze, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings, the sturdy table, the bookshelves filled with more volumes than she would have expected, the carefully crafted bed where she had spent the past week healing. "I think it's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You've made something that's truly yours." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I have it that." As the days passed, Pearl began to move about the cabin, initially leaning heavily on a walking stick Yates had fashioned for her, then gradually requiring it less. She insisted on contributing to the household, mending Yates's shirts with neat stitches, and taking over the cooking as her strength returned. One morning, she discovered a small journal among Yates's books, filled with sketches of wildlife and landscapes. When he returned from checking his traps, she had it open on her lap. "These are beautiful," she said, not looking up from a detailed drawing of an eagle in flight. "You never mentioned you were an artist." Yates hung his hat on a peg by the door, looking momentarily embarrassed. "Just a hobby to pass the time." "No, these are special," Pearl insisted, turning the pages carefully. "You see things differently than most people." He approached and sat beside her, watching as she examined his work. "My mother taught me. She used to say drawing helps you truly see the world around you." Pearl paused at a sketch of a woman sitting by a river, her face turned away. "Who is she?" Yates was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he wouldn't answer. "My wife, Elizabeth," he finally said. "She died of fever while I was away on a mission. That's why I left the Rangers." Pearl closed the journal gently. "I'm so sorry, Yates. It was 7 years ago now." His voice was steady, though his eyes held old pain. "I couldn't save her because I wasn't there. That's why when I found you in that canyon," he met her gaze directly, "I couldn't ride away." The confession hung between them, intimate and raw. Pearl reached out hesitantly and placed her hand on his. "Thank you for not riding away." Yates turned his hand to clasp hers, the simple touch conveying more than words could express. The next day, Yates announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Mrs. Abernathy will come stay with you," he explained as he strapped on his gun belt. "I should be back by sundown tomorrow." Pearl tried to hide her disappointment at his absence. "I'll be fine. You've done so much already." Yates paused at the door. "There's something else. I'm going to send a telegram to the marshal in the county where your farm is located. I know a few lawmen in these parts who can be trusted. We need to find out what your stepbrother's been up to since your death." Pearl's heart raced at the reminder of why she was here. In the comfortable routine they had established, she had almost managed to forget the danger that waited beyond the cabin walls. "Be careful," she urged. "If Liam is involved with bank robbers, they won't take kindly to questions." Yates adjusted his hat with a confidence that suggested he'd faced far worse than Pearl's stepbrother. "I'll be discreet, but it's time we started making plans. You can't hide out here forever." After he left Mrs. Abernathy arrived, a stout woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She brought with her a bundle of clothing. "Thought you might be tired of wearing Yates's old shirts," she said, laying out simple but well-made dresses on the bed. "These belonged to my daughter before she moved to California with her husband." Pearl ran her fingers over the soft fabric of a blue calico dress. "They're lovely. Are you sure she won't mind?" Mrs. Abernathy waved a dismissive hand. "Rebecca has fancy city clothes now. She'd want them to be used." She gave Pearl an appraising look. "You're the first woman Yates has brought to his cabin, you know. He's kept to himself since he settled here." Pearl felt her cheeks warm. "He saved my life. There's nothing more to it than that." The older woman's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise. "If you say so, dear. Now, let's see if these need any taking in." By the time Yates returned the following evening, Pearl was dressed in the blue calico, her hair washed and braided neatly. Mrs. Abernathy had departed earlier with a promise to return in a few days, leaving behind a freshly baked apple pie and several cryptic comments about young folks finding happiness when they least expect it. Yates stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Pearl's transformed appearance. "You look better," he managed, setting down his saddlebags. Pearl laughed at his awkwardness. "Mrs. Abernathy brought clothes, and she helped me wash my hair properly." "It suits you," he said, more composed now. "That color brings out your eyes." Pearl busied herself serving the stew she had prepared, hoping he wouldn't notice her blush. "Did you learn anything in town?" Yates's expression turned serious as he removed his hat and coat. "I did. The telegram came back while I was there." He sat at the table, accepting the bowl she offered. "Your stepbrother and his friends robbed another bank 2 counties over last week. 3 people were killed." Pearl sank into the chair opposite him, her appetite gone. "Oh God." "There's more," Yates continued. "They've taken over your farm completely. Your stepmother is telling everyone you ran off with a traveling salesman, abandoning your claim to the property." "That's a lie," Pearl exclaimed. "I would never." "Of course it's a lie," Yates agreed, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "But it's convenient for them. No one's looking for your body and they've got control of the farm." Pearl withdrew her hand, standing to pace the small room. "So they've gotten away with it." "With everything?" "Not yet, they haven't," Yates said firmly. "The marshal I contacted is keeping an eye on them. He suspects they're using your father's farm as a hideout between robberies, but he needs evidence before he can move in." "And what am I supposed to do?" Pearl asked, frustration evident in her voice. "Hide out here forever while they destroy everything my father built." Yates regarded her thoughtfully. "No, we're going to get your farm back, but we need to be smart about it." He hesitated. "I've been thinking about this for days now. I think I should go there, see the situation for myself." Pearl stopped pacing. "You would do that. I told you, you're mine to protect now," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I can pose as a drifter looking for work. Your stepbrother doesn't know me." "It's too dangerous," Pearl protested. "These men are killers. If they suspect anything, I spent 10 years tracking criminals with the Rangers," Yates reminded her. "I can handle myself." Pearl knew there was truth in his words, yet the thought of him putting himself at risk for her cause filled her with dread. Over the weeks of her recovery, he had become more than her rescuer. He was her friend, her confidant, and perhaps something more that she dared not name. "When would you go?" she asked quietly. "Within the week." Yates's eyes held her steadily. "But I won't leave you alone. Mrs. Abernathy has offered to have you stay with her while I'm gone." Pearl nodded slowly, knowing that despite her objections, this was their best hope of reclaiming her inheritance and bringing Liam to justice. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said solemnly, "and when I return, we'll decide our next move together." That night, sleep eluded Pearl. She lay awake, listening to Yates's steady breathing from his bedroll near the hearth. Since her arrival, he had insisted on giving her his bed while he slept on the floor. Now, with his departure imminent, she realized how much she had come to depend on his presence, his quiet strength, and the sense of safety he provided. In the darkness, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to ignore. She was falling in love with Yates Thornton. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Her father's marriage to Liam's mother had taught Pearl the dangers of trusting too easily. Yet everything about Yates, his honesty, his kindness, his unwavering sense of right, told her he was nothing like the men she had known before. 4 days later, Pearl stood outside Mrs. Abernathy's whitewashed cottage, watching as Yates secured his bedroll behind his saddle. He had spent the morning explaining his plan, how he would approach the farm looking for work, observe the comings and goings, and gather information without arousing suspicion. "I'll be gone 3 weeks at most," he assured her, checking the pistol at his hip before returning it to its holster. "If I haven't returned by then, Mrs. Abernathy will contact Marshal Ellison." Pearl nodded, trying to appear brave despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I've packed you some food for the journey." She handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and for a moment, neither moved away. Yates looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Pearl, he began, then stopped, seeming to think better of whatever he had been about to say. Instead, he surprised her by reaching out to touch her cheek gently. "Wait for me." It wasn't quite a question, nor was it a command. Pearl leaned slightly into his touch. "I will." With that simple promise between them, Yates mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Pearl standing in the yard with Mrs. Abernathy's comforting hand on her shoulder. "He'll come back," the older woman said confidently. "I've never seen a man more determined." Pearl hoped she was right. Life at Mrs. Abernathy's cottage fell into a comfortable routine. The widow was kind but firm, insisting that Pearl continue to build her strength by helping with household chores and tending to the small garden behind the house. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, Mrs. Abernathy knitting while Pearl read aloud from one of the books Yates had lent her. 2 weeks passed with no word from Yates, though Mrs. Abernathy assured Pearl this was to be expected. "He can hardly send a telegram without revealing where you are," she reasoned. No news is good news in this case. On the 16th day, Pearl was hanging laundry when she noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon. Her heart leaped with hope, but as the rider drew closer, she realized it wasn't Yates but a stranger on an unfamiliar horse, Mrs. Abernathy emerged from the cottage, a shotgun in her hands. "Get inside, girl," she ordered, her jovial manner replaced by steely resolve. Pearl obeyed, watching through the window as the rider approached. He was a young man, barely more than a boy, with sandy hair and a nervous expression. "Madam," she heard him call to Mrs. Abernathy. "I'm looking for Miss Pearl Kincaid. Mr. Thornton sent me." Pearl rushed outside, ignoring Mrs. Abernathy's protests. "What's happened? Is Yates all right?" The young man removed his hat. "Name's Tommy Ellis, miss. I work at the livery in Preston's Crossing. Mr. Thornton paid me to bring you this." He handed her a folded piece of paper. Said it was urgent. With trembling hands, Pearl unfolded the note. Yates's bold handwriting covered the page. "Pearl, your stepbrother and his gang are planning another robbery the bank in Silver Creek. 3 days from when you receive this. I've alerted the marshal, but Liam is suspicious of newcomers since the last job went wrong. I've been careful, but I can't risk sending more messages after this. The evidence we need is at the farm. In your father's study, behind the painting of the mountains, there's a safe. Your stepbrother doesn't know about it, but I'm certain that's where your father kept the deed to the property. Meet me in Silver Creek. Tommy will escort you. Bring Mrs. Abernathy if she'll come. I need your help to end this, but I won't lie to you, it could be dangerous. If you choose not to come, I'll understand. Either way, I'll return to you when this is finished. Yours, Yates. Pearl read the letter twice, her mind racing. Silver Creek was a day's ride away. If they left immediately, they would arrive with time to spare before the robbery. Mrs. Abernathy, Pearl called, her decision made. We need to pack. We're leaving for Silver Creek. The older woman looked skeptical but not surprised. I figured as much. That man has trouble following him like a shadow. She turned to Tommy. Boy, you'd better come inside and have something to eat while we get ready. It's going to be a long ride. By sunset, they were on the trail, Pearl riding a gentle mare borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy's neighbor, the widow herself seated firmly on her own sturdy gelding, and Tommy leading the way. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses, and reached Silver Creek by late afternoon the next day. The town was larger than Pearl had expected, with a main street lined with businesses and a gleaming new bank building at its center. Tommy led them to a small hotel at the quieter end of town. Mr. Thornton said to get rooms here and wait, he explained. He'll find you. They had just settled into their adjoining rooms when a knock came at Pearl's door. She opened it cautiously, then gasped with relief at the sight of Yates standing in the hallway. He looked different. His beard was fuller, his clothes dustier, and a weariness shadowed his eyes. But when he smiled at the sight of her, he was the same Yates who had rescued her from the canyon. You came, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Without thinking, Pearl threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. Yates stiffened in surprise, then his arms encircled her, holding her close. I was so worried, she murmured against his shirt. His hand came up to stroke her hair. I'm all right, but we don't have much time. He gently disentangled himself, though he kept hold of her hands. Your stepbrother and his gang will be here tomorrow. The marshal has deputies positioned around town, but they're keeping their distance until the gang makes their move. Pearl nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than the lingering warmth of his embrace. Your letter mentioned my father's safe. I had no idea it existed. Your father showed it to me once, Yates admitted. I came through your town about a year before you and I met, had some trouble with my horse, and your father let me stay at your farm while I waited for repairs. He smiled at the memory. We got to talking. Good man, your father. Pearl stared at him in astonishment. You knew my father, why didn't you tell me? I didn't make the connection at first, Yates explained. When you told me your full name and about the farm, I realized who you were. John Kincaid spoke of his daughter often, said you were the light of his life. Tears welled in Pearl's eyes. He never mentioned you. No reason he should have. I was just a passing stranger he showed kindness to. Yates squeezed her hands, but he did show me that safe when he got out some papers he wanted to discuss. Said no one knew about it except you, and he intended to keep it that way until the right time came. What's in it? Pearl asked. Besides the deed, I don't know, but your father seemed to think it was important enough to keep secret from his new wife and stepson. Yates released her hands and moved to the window, peering out at the street below. After the robbery is stopped, we'll need to get to your farm and find whatever's in that safe. It might be the key to getting back what's rightfully yours. And what about Liam? If the marshal arrests him for the robbery, he'll face justice for that crime, but unless we can prove he tried to kill you, he won't answer for what he did to you. Yates turned back to her, his expression determined. That's why we need what's in that safe. Your father might have left something that can help us. Pearl sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. Just weeks ago, she had been left for dead at the bottom of a canyon. Now she was about to confront the man who had tried to kill her. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, lifting her chin with resolve. Yates regarded her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Tomorrow, when they come for the bank, you need to stay here out of sight. After it's over, if all goes well, we'll ride for your farm immediately." "And if all doesn't go well?" Pearl asked quietly. Yates didn't answer immediately. "Mrs. Abernathy has instructions to get you to safety if I don't return." Pearl stood, crossing the room to stand before him. "No, I didn't come all this way to hide in a hotel room. I'm coming with you tomorrow." "Pearl, it's too dangerous. It's my life they tried to take," she interrupted firmly. "My farm they stole. I deserve to see justice done." They argued for several minutes, but in the end, Yates reluctantly agreed that Pearl could observe from a safe distance, under Mrs. Abernathy's watchful eye. As night fell over Silver Creek, tension hung in the air like the charged atmosphere before a storm. Yates stayed with Pearl late into the evening, going over every detail of their plan, until Mrs. Abernathy knocked on the adjoining door and insisted they all needed rest for the day ahead. "You should go," Pearl said softly, though everything in her wanted him to stay. Yates nodded, but he lingered by the door. "Pearl, there's something I need to tell you in case tomorrow doesn't go as planned." Her heart quickened at the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" He took a step toward her, then another, until he stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "When I found you in that canyon, I thought I was saving your life." His voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "I didn't realize you'd end up saving mine." Before Pearl could respond, Yates leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. For a heartbeat, she was too surprised to react. Then she was kissing him back, her hands finding their way to his shoulders as his arms encircled her waist. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks now." Pearl smiled, feeling a happiness that pushed aside her fear for tomorrow. "What took you so long, Mr. Thornton?" he chuckled softly. "I reckon I was waiting for the right moment." His expression grew serious again. "Tomorrow, stay safe. I can't lose you now that I've found you." With one last kiss, briefer but no less tender than the first, Yates left her room. Pearl touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss, and for the first time since her fall into the canyon, she allowed herself to believe in a future full of promise. The next morning dawned clear and bright, belying the danger that approached with each passing hour. Pearl dressed carefully in one of the dresses Mrs. Abernathy had given her, pinning her hair up under a modest bonnet that would help conceal her face. If Liam spotted her before the trap was sprung, all their plans would be for naught. Yates met them in the hotel dining room, accompanied by a stern-faced man he introduced as Marshal Ellison. The lawman regarded Pearl with a mixture of skepticism and sympathy. "Miss Kincaid, I've heard quite a tale about you," he said. "If half of what Thornton here says is true, you're either the unluckiest or the luckiest woman in the territory, depending on how you look at it." Pearl offered a small smile. "I prefer to think of myself as fortunate, Marshal. Not everyone gets a second chance at life." The Marshal nodded approvingly. "Well, let's make sure that second chance lasts longer than the first. I've got men stationed throughout town. When your stepbrother and his gang make their move, we'll be ready." The plan was straightforward. Pearl and Mrs. Abernathy would watch from the milliner's shop across the street from the bank, while Yates would position himself closer to the action, ready to identify Liam for the Marshal's men. When the gang was apprehended, Yates would immediately escort Pearl and Mrs. Abernathy out of town, heading for the Kincaid farm to secure the evidence they needed. By mid-morning, the streets of Silver Creek were busy with the usual Saturday traffic, farmers in town for supplies, ladies shopping, children darting between wagons and horses. Pearl sat by the milliner's front window, pretending to examine a hat while keeping watch on the bank entrance. "Try to look natural, dear," Mrs. Abernathy murmured beside her. "You're as stiff as a board." Pearl forced herself to relax, though her eyes never stopped scanning the street. She spotted Yates leaning against a post outside the general store, casually smoking a cigarette as he too watched the comings and goings. Just past noon, a group of 5 riders entered the town from the east, moving at an unhurried pace that nonetheless drew Pearl's attention. The leader was a tall man with a shock of red hair visible beneath his hat. Liam. Beside him rode a heavyset man Pearl recognized as one of his drinking companions, and 3 others she didn't know. "They're here," she whispered to Mrs. Abernathy, her throat suddenly dry. The older woman squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just keep calm, the marshal knows what he's doing." The 5 men dismounted in front of the saloon, tethering their horses to the hitching post. They entered the establishment, and for a tense half-hour, nothing happened. Pearl began to wonder if they had somehow been warned, but then the saloon doors swung open and the men emerged, now walking with purpose toward the bank. Everything happened very quickly after that. The gang entered the bank, and within minutes, shouts and a gunshot rang out. People on the street scattered for cover as the bank doors burst open and the robbers emerged, guns drawn. But instead of the clean getaway they had planned, they found themselves facing the marshal and 6 deputies, all with weapons trained on them. "Drop your weapons," Marshal Ellison commanded. "You're surrounded." For a moment, it seemed the gang might surrender. Then Liam raised his gun and fired at the nearest deputy. Chaos erupted as bullets flew in both directions. From her position in the milliner's shop, Pearl watched in horror as one of the gang members fell, then another. Liam and the remaining 2 men made a dash for their horses, firing wildly as they ran. Yates had moved from his position and was now crouched behind a water trough, his own gun drawn. As Liam reached his horse, Yates stepped into view, blocking his path. "Liam Kincaid," he called out. "It's over." Liam whirled, his face contorted with rage and fear. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who knows what you did to your stepsister," Yates replied, his gun steady in his hand. A flash of confusion crossed Liam's face, followed by a dawning realization. "She's alive, that's not possible." "Drop the gun, Kincaid," Yates ordered, stepping closer. Pearl couldn't hear Liam's response over the commotion, but she saw his arm jerk upward, his pistol aiming at Yates. Without thinking, she bolted from the milliner's shop, ignoring Mrs. Abernathy's cry of alarm. "Liam!" she shouted, running into the street. Her stepbrother froze at the sound of her voice, his face draining of color as he turned to see her standing there. "Pearl!" How, in that moment of distraction, Yates lunged forward, tackling Liam to the ground. The gun discharged harmlessly into the air as the 2 men struggled in the dust. Marshal Ellison and his deputies, having subdued the other gang members, quickly converged on the scene. Within moments, Liam was disarmed and in handcuffs, staring at Pearl as if she were a ghost. "You're supposed to be dead," he spat. "I watched you fall." "And I watched you count the money from the Prescott robbery," Pearl replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You'll hang for murder, Liam, even if it wasn't mine." As the marshal led Liam away, Yates approached Pearl, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. "I told you to stay in the shop." "You're welcome," she retorted, though her legs felt suddenly weak as the danger passed. "He was going to shoot you." Yates sighed, then surprised her by pulling her into a quick, fierce embrace. "Don't ever scare me like that again." Mrs. Abernathy hurried over to them, looking scandalized by their public display but too relieved to scold them properly. "Is it over?" she asked. Yates released Pearl but kept a protective arm around her shoulders. "Not quite. We need to get to the Kincaid farm before news of the arrests reaches Pearl's stepmother. We have to find what's in that safe." Within the hour, they were on the road, having borrowed fresh horses from the livery. The journey to the Kincaid farm would take the rest of the day, and they rode hard, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. As dusk fell, the familiar outline of the farmhouse appeared on the horizon. Pearl felt a surge of emotions at the sight: grief for her father, anger at the betrayal she had suffered, and a bittersweet joy at returning to the only home she had ever known. "We should approach carefully," Yates advised as they drew closer. "Your stepmother might have hired hands still loyal to her." But the farm appeared deserted as they rode into the yard. The house stood silent, the barn door ajar and the chicken coop empty. "She must have fled when she heard about Liam," Pearl surmised, dismounting in front of the house she had grown up in. Inside, signs of hasty departure were evident: drawers left open, items scattered on the floor. They made their way to her father's study, a small room at the back of the house that Pearl had avoided since his death. It remained largely as he had left it, with his pipe still resting in an ashtray and his reading glasses folded on top of a ledger. Pearl crossed to the painting that hung behind his desk, a landscape of the mountains where he had proposed to her mother long ago. She lifted it carefully from the wall to reveal a small iron safe built into the stonework of the fireplace. "You know the combination?" Yates asked, stepping closer. Pearl nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "My birthday." She turned the dial with practiced movements: 4 right, 22 left, 59 right, and the safe door swung open with a soft click. Inside was a stack of documents, a small leather pouch, and a letter addressed simply to Pearl. With trembling hands, she withdrew the contents, setting them on her father's desk. The documents included the deed to the farm, as expected, along with her father's the real will, not the altered version her stepmother had presented after his death. It clearly stated that the entire property was to pass to Pearl upon his death, with only a small allowance provided for his widow. The leather pouch contained several gold coins and a delicate gold locket that had belonged to Pearl's mother. But it was the letter that captured her attention completely. She broke the seal and unfolded it, recognizing her father's handwriting. "My dearest Pearl, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found reason to open the safe I showed you. I pray that reason is simply curiosity or the need for the deed, but I fear it may be something darker. I must confess that I have made a terrible mistake in my marriage to Alina. I believed her to be a good woman in need of security, and I thought her son might be a companion for you after your mother's passing left us both so alone. I was wrong. In recent months, I have discovered troubling things about Liam. He has fallen in with dangerous men and is involved in activities that could bring ruin upon us all. I have confronted Alina about her son's behavior, but she defends him blindly. I have changed my will to protect your inheritance, keeping this true copy hidden where only you can find it. If anything happens to me before I can set things right, take this will to Judge Patterson in town. He will ensure justice is done. Know that I love you more than life itself, my darling girl. Whatever darkness may come, remember that the light always returns. Your loving father, John Kincaid." Pearl finished reading, tears streaming down her face. Yates, who had been examining the other documents, moved to her side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Your father was trying to protect you," he said softly. "He knew something was wrong." Pearl nodded, wiping her tears away. "And now we have proof, the will, the deed, everything we need to reclaim what's mine." Mrs. Abernathy, who had been keeping watch at the window, joined them at the desk. "What will you do now, dear? This is a lot of farm for a young woman to manage alone." Pearl looked around the study, then beyond to the farmhouse that held so many memories, both beautiful and painful. "I don't know yet, but I do know I won't be alone." Her eyes met Yates's, and in his steady gaze, she found the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined when he first found her broken and dying in that canyon. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Judge Patterson, true to her father's faith in him, acted swiftly to validate the will and restore Pearl's legal ownership of the farm. Liam and his remaining gang members were jailed awaiting trial for multiple robberies and 3 counts of murder. Pearl's stepmother had fled across the territorial line, but was eventually apprehended by authorities in Nevada. Through it all, Yates remained by Pearl's side, helping her set the farm to rights and hiring trustworthy hands to manage the work. Mrs. Abernathy returned to her own cottage but visited often, bringing baked goods and practical advice for the young couple. As spring gave way to summer, Pearl and Yates settled into a comfortable routine. They had moved his books and few possessions from the canyon cabin, which he had decided to sell. Each evening they would sit on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I've been thinking," Yates said one such evening, his arm draped casually across Pearl's shoulders. "This farm needs a proper owner." Pearl looked at him in confusion. "I am the proper owner. The deed's in my name now." Yates smiled, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small box. "That's not what I meant." Pearl's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "Yates, I found you half dead in a canyon and promised to protect you," he said, taking her hand in his. "I didn't know then that you'd end up protecting me too from loneliness, from the ghosts of my past. You gave me a reason to live again, Pearl Kincaid." He slid off the porch swing to kneel before her. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making this farm our home together?" Pearl felt tears of joy spring to her eyes as she nodded emphatically. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally parted, both laughing and a little breathless, Pearl rested her forehead against his. "You know," she said teasingly, "when you told me I was yours to protect, I never imagined this is where we'd end up." Yates brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression tender. "I think maybe I did. From the moment I found you, something told me you were meant to be part of my life." He kissed her again, briefly but sweetly. "And I plan to keep my promise to protect you for the rest of our days." They were married that autumn in a small ceremony on the farm, with Mrs. Abernathy beaming proudly in the front row and the judge who had restored Pearl's inheritance officiating. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of golden leaves, Pearl couldn't help but think of how far she had come from that terrible day in the canyon. Life had taught her that the deepest canyons sometimes led to the highest peaks, and that being left for dead could, in the most unexpected way, become the beginning of truly living. 10 years later, the Thornton farm was thriving. The original Kincaid homestead had expanded to include additional acreage, a new barn, and a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Pearl and Yates had been blessed with 3 children: 8-year-old John, named for her father, 6-year-old Elizabeth, after Yates's first wife, and 3-year-old Grace, whose arrival had been as unexpected as she was welcome. On the anniversary of the day Yates had found Pearl in the canyon, they always took a private moment to remember. This year, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch swing, a quilt wrapped around their shoulders against the autumn chill. 10 years, Pearl marveled, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Yates pressed a kiss to her temple, "and sometimes it feels like you've always been part of my life. Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking on a half-dead woman and all the trouble that came with her," Yates chuckled, drawing her closer. "Not for a single moment. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." He gazed out at the prosperous farm, at the life they had built together. "Although I do sometimes wonder." "Wonder what?" Pearl prompted when he didn't continue. "What might have happened if I'd taken a different trail that day, if I hadn't heard you in that canyon." His arms tightened around her. "The thought terrifies me still." Pearl turned in his embrace to look up at him. The years had added a few strands of silver to his hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but to her, he was as handsome as the day he had carried her from the canyon. "But you did take that trail," she reminded him. "You did find me, and you kept your promise to protect me." Yates smiled, touching his forehead to hers in a gesture that had become their own private sign of affection. "And I always will, Pearl, till the end of our days." As the stars appeared one by one in the vast Arizona sky, Pearl and Yates remained on the porch, wrapped in the quilt and in each other's arms, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. and the love that had transformed a rescue into a lifetime of happiness.